Right, so today's submitted material is a short script from Echoes of Existence, The Anatomy of Modern Anxiety, that re-examines Edvard Munch's The Scream, highlighting how elements like the Krakatoa eruption influenced the painting and marked a historical shift in art from traditional beauty to raw emotional anxiety. And jumping right into our first critique, integrating the external environmental trigger more tightly with the internal emotional revelation will really strengthen the piece's core argument about existential dread.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because right now we need to look at the mechanical execution of how that historical detail is introduced right at the top of the script.
Right.
The author gives us this incredibly poetic, deeply internal quote from Munch about feeling an infinite scream passing through nature.
Hmm.
And as a reader, you are right there with him.
Yeah, you really feel that raw subjective panic.
Exactly. But then abruptly, the script pivots to a geological fact about volcanic dust from the Krakatoa eruption turning skies red across Europe.
It reads a bit like nature is screaming. And fun fact, historians believe it was because of a volcano.
Right, it's jarring.
So as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that nature itself is physically screaming at him. But is there a risk that dropping in the Krakatoa historical detail as a standalone fact actually distracts the audience from that raw emotional punch?
That is exactly the risk, yeah.
Mhm.
The stumbling block the writer runs into here is that the detail about the volcanic dust currently functions as an isolated piece of trivia,
Uh-huh.
which creates a severe clash of cognitive processing for the reader. I mean, think about the psychology of reading.
Right, you're pulling them out of the emotion.
Exactly. When you give an audience a deeply emotional, poetic quote, you are engaging their limbic system. They are processing feelings.
Yeah.
But the moment you drop in a geographical location and a historical timeline, you force their brain to switch into a logical prefrontal cortex processing state.
It's like cognitive whiplash. You pull them out of the nightmare to give them an earth science lesson. But, I mean, the fact itself is crucial to the thesis, right?
Oh, absolutely. The whole point of the script is to prove that the environment was an active participant in this panic attack.
So if I'm the writer, how do I actually fix this on the page? Do I just need to flesh out the timeline of the eruption so it makes more logical sense?
Actually, I would argue that adding more geographical logic would make the problem worse.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to fix this, the writer needs to make the historical fact serve the emotional feeling. The goal is to weave the Krakatoa context directly into the explanation of the quote, to show, rather than just tell, how the external world physically overwhelmed the artist.
Okay, so show don't tell.
Precisely. We don't want Krakatoa to be a piece of trivia that historians debate. We need Krakatoa to be the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that forced Munch to cover his ears.
So we have to fuse the external physical pressure with the internal psychological break. What does that actually look like when we get down to the sentence level?
Well, let's look at the transition immediately following the quote about the scream passing through nature.
Okay.
Instead of starting a new paragraph about historical theories, the script could just note that it wasn't a metaphor. Like, volcanic dust from Krakatoa had literally turned the skies over Europe a blood red, creating an environment that physically pressed down on him.
Oh, I see what you're doing there. The language becomes aggressive and active.
Yeah, it's not a past tense trivia point anymore.
Right, it's an active antagonist in the scene. You aren't just saying, oh, by the way, there was a volcano. You're saying the sky was bleeding and the weight of that unnatural sky crushed him.
Exactly. You are making the reader feel the heat and the dust. Another way to approach it is to connect the volcanic ash directly to the figure's physical reaction in the painting.
Oh, like covering his ears?
Yeah, you could write something like, he wasn't imagining the apocalypse. The ash from Krakatoa had painted the sky so heavily that the air itself felt unbreathable,
Wow, yeah.
forcing him to cover his ears against the sheer crushing volume of nature breaking down.
That's a really crucial distinction because it explains the why behind the most famous element of the painting. We are taking the external trigger, the volcano, and locking it directly to the internal reaction, the hands over the ears.
And when you do that, you aren't just sharing trivia anymore, you are establishing a rigid law of causality for your script, where the external environment dictates the internal reality.
Right, which sets up the entire rest of the analysis. And that brings up my biggest issue with the second half of the script. Grounding the abstract claim about the historical shift in art with a brief, vivid contrast against traditional aesthetics will make the conclusion significantly more impactful.
That is the massive hurdle here. Yeah. The narrative through line naturally shifts from the specific painting to its broader legacy.
Yeah.
And the script makes this monumental claim that art stopped being about beauty and became about emotion, fundamentally changing modern art forever.
But because no baseline of traditional beauty is established earlier in the text, this grand conclusion feels unearned. Like the contrast is stated but not deeply felt by the reader.
Exactly.
The material makes a strong case for emotion here, but it's a bit like ending a movie review by claiming a film destroyed all romantic comedy cliches without ever mentioning what those cliches were. We need to feel the weight of the traditional beauty it replaced.
That is a perfect analogy. Without a clear status quo, there can be no disruption. It comes down to the mechanics of how human beings process narrative stakes.
Right, you need that contrast to trigger a response.
Exactly. A kind of narrative dopamine hit. If you just describe a twisted, ugly face, the reader registers it as grotesque, sure.
Yeah.
But if you spend just a moment painting a picture of a beautiful, perfectly proportioned classical landscape, and then you smash that image with Munch's grotesque reality,
You activate the reader's understanding of rebellion. You kind of have to build the wall before you can tear it down.
precisely.
But let me push back a bit on the execution of that idea. I mean, this is supposed to be a short, punchy script analyzing one specific painting.
Right.
If we stop the momentum to build this wall of traditional beauty, aren't we risking turning an engaging, fast-paced narrative into a dry 15-minute art history lecture on 19th century salon portraiture?
That is a very real danger if it's handled clumsily. We absolutely do not want a textbook chapter on the rigid rules of the European academies.
So how do we avoid that?
What the writer needs to do is introduce a micro-contrast right at the pivot point of the script.
A micro-contrast?
Yeah, just a sharp single-sentence juxtaposition to illustrate exactly what beauty meant before this painting arrived to disrupt the status quo.
Oh, okay, so you magnify the impact of the shift toward emotional intensity without dragging the pacing to a halt.
Exactly.
I like the idea of a micro-contrast. How do we paint that picture in 3 seconds, though? Do we focus on the brushstrokes or the subjects or the colors?
You focus on the expectation of the viewer at that time. Right before stating that art became about emotion, the text could briefly contrast the painting against the era's norms.
Like saying before this art was about serene landscapes and heroic portraits.
Yes, exactly. Or when describing the twisted face, emphasize that it deliberately abandoned the traditional pursuit of perfect, beautiful proportions to instead capture the ugly reality of pure anxiety.
Oh, so instead of just saying the face is distorted, you frame the physical distortion as an intentional attack on the traditions of the era.
Right. You could write something like this figure abandons any obsession with beautiful, realistic anatomy. It didn't care about looking human. It only cared about looking like pure anxiety.
That entirely changes the stakes of the piece. It transforms Munch from just a guy who had a panic attack on a bridge into a revolutionary.
Absolutely. And that is how you analyze the legacy effectively. When you discuss how art moved from beauty to raw emotion, you have to prove to the listener that the shift was necessary.
Because the old rules simply couldn't contain the new anxieties. That contrast is the engine that drives the entire second half of the script.
Right. And it sets up the final emotional payoff perfectly.
Which leads us exactly to how the audience digests that legacy today. Because if we establish that the old rules couldn't contain the new anxieties, we have to talk about our new anxieties. Expanding on the specific reasons this piece resonates so deeply in 2026 provides a much more satisfying and resonant payoff to the initial hook.
This is the critical final piece of the puzzle. The script has done the work of explaining the historical legacy and the shift from traditional beauty.
Right.
Now it needs to translate that legacy directly to the audience experiencing the material right now in their own lives.
Okay, so what I really like about this part of the draft is the pivot to the modern day. The material notes that people in 2026 still relate to the painting because there are no monsters, no war, just one person silently overwhelmed.
It's a very poetic observation.
And the specific anxieties of 2026 fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster to make the legacy hit harder?
I think it definitely needs bolstering. It leaves the modern relevance feeling a bit generalized.
Yeah, like leaving the diagnosis at no monsters makes the modern connection a little too vague.
Exactly. The issue here is that while noting the absence of monsters in war is a strong observation, it stops just short of explicitly connecting the painting's legacy to the modern viewer's specific ambient anxieties.
Right.
It's an accurate diagnosis of what is missing from the painting, but an incomplete diagnosis of the modern audience.
It feels like we are almost there, but we haven't quite closed the loop. So if I'm revising this, do I start listing out current events? Do I talk about social media algorithms and smartphones? Because I worried that if we lean too hard into phones are bad, it's going to sound incredibly preachy and alienate the listener.
Oh yeah, that is exactly the trap you want to avoid. You absolutely do not want to lecture the audience or wag a finger at screen time.
Right.
Instead of preaching, the writer needs to mirror. Connect the legacy of the painting directly to the modern audience's daily experience of existential overload, turning the concept of legacy into a living, breathing reality.
How do we thread that needle then? How do we say 2026 is stressful without sounding like a grumpy editorial?
By focusing on the texture of the modern environment rather than the specific tools, instead of solely listing what isn't in the painting, like no monsters or no war, briefly frame what is there as a direct mirror to modern life.
Oh, okay. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Instead of just saying there are no monsters, the script could say, in a 2026 world filled with constant digital noise and ambient dread, we are all that figure, silently overwhelmed by an environment that feels too loud.
I see. An environment that feels too loud. You don't have to literally say the word smartphones because the audience instantly fills in that blank with their own personal experiences.
Exactly. You trust the audience's lived experience to do the heavy lifting for you.
That is incredibly effective because it completes the psychological circuit of the entire script.
Yeah, it really does.
You start with a man in the 19th century, physically overwhelmed by the sheer volume of volcanic ash crushing the sky. You explain how that shattered the rules of serene, traditional beauty. And then you land the plane by showing the listener that the exact same emotional mechanism is firing in their own brain right now, triggered by the ambient dread of 2026.
And when you analyze the legacy in that way, the script stops being a mere explanation of a famous painting. It becomes deeply urgent.
Right.
The listener isn't just learning about Edvard Munch. They're being given a framework to understand their own anxiety.
Right. That is how you leverage art history to create genuine resonance. So let's quickly recap the core actionable takeaways for the writer to implement in their next draft. First, weaving the Krakatoa detail directly into the emotional thesis to show rather than tell how the external world physically overwhelmed the artist.
Second, vividly contrasting the painting against traditional beauty to validate its legacy, using a micro-contrast to illustrate exactly what beauty meant before this painting disrupted the status quo.
And finally, connecting the legacy of the painting directly to the modern audience's daily experience of existential overload, grounding that historical legacy in the immediate, relatable present without sounding preachy.
I really think if the listener remembers to explicitly define the traditions their subjects are breaking and weave their historical facts directly into their emotional arguments, this material will elevate from an interesting observation to a truly profound piece of analysis.
I completely agree. We warmly invite the listener to revise their script based on these structural and thematic notes and submit the updated material back into the show for another critique. Keep writing, keep revising, and we will catch you on the next critique.